why is the dollar so strong? The answer is, for this, you have to go behind the curtain. You have to look into what's called the plumbing of the international monetary system. And I had a discussion, and this goes back, this is 1980. So I'm an young, up and coming vice president of Citibank. That's back in the days when it was a bank before they turned it into a hedge fund. So I'm like a 27 or whatever, a 28 maybe year old lawyer, but I'm talking to Walter Wriston. It's a one-on-one conversation. He was, for those who don't know the name or don't recall, he was probably the second greatest banker of the 20th century after Pierpont Morgan. So I'll give Morgan the prize. But he left around 1910, and Wriston was the inventor of the Eurodollar. The negotiable certificate of deposit. Eurodollars are around a little bit earlier, but he took the CD that was your interest in the Eurodollar and made them negotiable and tradable. So I'm having a conversation with him, and I had just seen this movie, which I highly recommend. Chris Christopherson, Hume Cronin, and Jane Fonda. It's called Rollover, and it's again 1980. But all-star cast. I got a murder mystery, a little sex thrown in, but it's basically about the collapse of confidence in the U.S. dollar. And Hume Cronin plays the Walter Wriston part. And basically the idea was, remember, this is during the Arab oil embargoes and the Iranian oil embargo, and price of oil quadrupled in 8 years and all that. So the theme was the Arabs are taking the money out of the banking system and buying gold, and they're stashing the gold away. And this is the collapse of the financial system. And that was sort of the plot. What about that? Everyone took their money out of the system and bought gold. Wouldn't that collapse the system? And he looked at me like I was a new kid on the block, which I was. And he said, well, what you have to understand is that you can take your money out of the bank and you can buy gold. But the person who sold you the gold got the money and they put it back in the bank. So it doesn't go anywhere. It's a closed circuit. And of course, now I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Of course, he's right. And he said, so the stability of the system doesn't depend on who sells what for dollars. Yeah, it affects exchange rates a little bit and interest rates with the price of gold. But he said the money it can't literally disappear. It has to go back into the system. It's a closed circuit. And of course, that's how the Eurodollar system works. But it presupposes that you can always borrow in the Eurodollar market. In other words, that closed circuit analogy is correct, provided the big banks are willing to lend to each other. So if my example, if UBS was selling the gold and to the Arabs and they got the money and they put it back in Citibank Nassau, it's all good. But what happens if that money supply, now I'm talking about Eurodollars, actually shrank? And that is a heart attack in the global financial system. So now we're like, well, okay, what's going on? And believe it or not, there's a global dollar shortage. And when you say that, people say, wait a second, you kidding me? The Fed printed, the Fed's balance sheet in 2008 at the start of the global financial crisis was $800 billion. It was $4.5 trillion by the time we got to the end of the taper in November 2014. Then, okay, Yellen a little bit, but mostly Powell got it. They started quantitative tightening. They got it back down to around 3.5 trillion by the time COVID came along. And then boom, it's up to 7.5 trillion, might have gone higher than that. And that's M0. M1 was exploding even more. So people go, so the Fed printed, $7.5 trillion. How could there be a dollar shortage? And that has a two-part answer. One is the money printing, at least M0, is irrelevant. It just doesn't matter because how do they print the money? The Fed buys securities from the primary dealers. And I was, after I left Citibank, I joined one of the biggest primary dealers and I was there for 10 years. So I had a front row seat. Here's the part that matters. What do the banks do with that money? They give it back to the Fed in the form of excess reserves. It's the bank deposit at the Fed, in effect. So that money never went anywhere. It was created. It is on the balance sheet, but it all went to the asset side, which were securities, and it never went into the economy. So where does the money come from that runs the economy? If you or I want to go shopping or go out to dinner,
a multiplier, right? Isn't that what?
Well, it comes from the commercial banks. It comes from M1. Yeah, there is a multiplier, but that's in M1 and M2. which is created by the banks at will. And the Fed, those commercial banks have as much printing power as the Fed. They just do it differently by lending money or buying securities and paying for them with money that they create. So and that never happened. It happened to some extent, but not nearly to the extent that of what the Fed was doing with M0. So M0 didn't really matter. I mean, I hate to break it to people, but the Fed kind of
Right.
doesn't matter. Commercial banks do matter. Euro dollars do matter. That's how we run the system.